next presenter, Nancy Cooper with the United States Army Corps of Engineers. Nancy Cooper is a chemist with the United States Army Corps of Engineers Environmental and Munitions Center of Expertise since January of 2025. She serves as an Army representative on the Environmental Data Quality Work Group and supports both the Quality Assurance Oversight and Data Review and Management subgroups. Prior to joining the Corps, Nancy was a chemist in the Air Force Technical Support Branch of the Environmental Restoration Division. She led various initiatives, including the development and revision of the DoD-DOE QSM-6 for environmental laboratories, as well as updates to the DoD data validation guidelines. Nancy holds a master's degree in chemistry from Case Western Reserve University, a bachelor's degree in chemistry, and a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Hiram College. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nancy.
Great, and hopefully you can hear me okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, so as Zach mentioned, my name is Nancy Cooper, and I'll be presenting the data validation guidelines for Module 6. And I want to say that I probably won't have time for questions. I have too much content, but the Data Review and Management Subgroup Chairperson, Dr. Melinda McCullen, will be monitoring the chat for me and respond with questions or potentially tracking for the subgroup to respond later. So first, I wanted to say thank you on behalf of the EDQW's Data Review and Management Subgroup. And we wanted to say thank you to those of you in the community who took the time to actually review the Module 6 draft document. We really appreciate the comments and the proposed resolutions you've provided. And please note that the subgroup is currently working on reviewing those comments. And so this presentation is based on the draft. And so if there's a comment of a specific topic and you don't see it implemented here today, know that we're still working on addressing those comments. But thank you again for your continued collaboration. So an overview of my presentation is first we'll discuss the recent updates to QSM 6.0 Appendix B tables and look at how the historical trends have shifted and why we are moving towards baseline minimum requirements rather than universally applying the strictest method criteria. And then we'll talk about how that impacts the overall data validation guideline approach. And then we'll cover some major updates, including the removal of the historic Appendix A and how we've transitioned to the concept-based acceptance criteria that's going to tie back to the UFP QAPs or your project-specific QAP. And then from there, we'll look at some specific EPA 1633 data validation module frameworks, and we'll explain a new dual framework design, which was intentionally drafted to increase EPA regulatory buy-in and broader acceptance while still maintaining the mandatory DoD project-specific needs. And then we'll spend some time discussing the stages of data validation, and we'll walk through the flow chart for our new proposed data validation scheme. And the overall goal here is to establish high confidence early in the analytical batch to ultimately reduce the data validator's workload down the field. And so one thing that I've done for this presentation is that anything that's new because of 6.0 or the data validation scheme, I've highlighted those in green. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so to understand where we are with the current guidelines, it really helps to understand the history of the Quality Systems Manual and how it was structured. So historically, earlier versions of the QSM Appendix B tables were compiled by taking the strictest requirements across multiple SW846 method versions. And this was intentional because for a long time, we saw the trend in these methods were predictable. Every time a new version of the method was released, it came with stricter acceptance criteria. However, in recent years, we've seen a distinct shift in this trend, and newer methods are no longer guaranteed to have more strict. And in fact, in some requirements, we've actually seen them becoming less stringent. And because of this reversal, compiling the absolute strictest requirement across the board is no longer practical or fair. And so let's look at how the QSM has adapted to this reality on the next slide. And so to adapt to these shifting trends without unfairly favoring one method version over another, 6.0 adjusted its approach, and in certain Appendix B tables, you'll see that we don't have an established universal one-size-fits-all requirement, and instead laboratories may be directed to follow the precision performance checks and acceptance criteria of the specific method version they are referencing. And so the key takeaway here is a fundamental shift in how you should be viewing the Appendix B tables. They are no longer a compilation of the absolute maximum restrictions, but instead the Appendix B tables provide a baseline for minimum requirements, and that has to be paired and rely upon the method-specific acceptance criteria to ensure full compliance. And this will ensure both scientific integrity as well as operational fairness across our projects. Okay, so now that we've established how the QSM has shifted those baseline requirements and method-specific criteria, let's talk about how that is applied to our data validation guidelines. And so the most significant update is to the template is the complete removal of the Appendix B from the data validation guidelines. And Appendix B previously housed the method QC tables. And so since we no longer have a static QSM Appendix B table to rely on, data validators must follow a new reference pathway. And the data validators would need to reference the project-specific QAP first, followed closely by the specific analytical reference method that was referenced by the laboratory and required by the project. And this ensures, oh, terribly sorry, 1 second. So this will ensure that the data validation is perfectly tailored to the exact rules of the project and the method version. And so this brings us to our updated data validation approach. Because we've shifted away from a rigid one-size-fits-all numerical table in the data validation guideline, some data validation criteria will no longer have those fixed numerical values, and instead the data validator would have to rely on concept-based acceptance criteria. And so that means the guidelines will guide you on how to evaluate the quality of the data based on the underlying scientific concepts, rather than just having you compare to a static number. And so this keeps our validation process highly robust, flexible, and aligned with the modern laboratory methods. And so how is this actually implemented into our daily workflows without getting lost in the details? And it really starts at the beginning of our data validation guidelines in the introduction. And so the introduction will play a critical role because it will formally identify the exact analytical reference method that was reviewed during development. And so since we are no longer relying on that single static QC table, it's more important than ever that our project teams are aligned. And specifically, we're talking about the project chemists and data validators working in tandem. Both parties need to be aware of the method-specific requirements, especially when dealing with related methods within the same analytical technological family. And we can't operate in silos. The data validator needs to know exactly what the chemist and the data in the laboratory have agreed upon. And so again, to make this process seamless and legally defensible, those requirements should not be a mystery. Ideally, all of the method-specific requirements and technology-specific nuances are documented upfront in our QAPs. And we know that we should be looking at QAP worksheets 28 and 36. And when these worksheets are filled out correctly, it gives the data validator a clear, unambiguous roadmap for the entire project. Okay, and what has always been true and remains true is that project-specific requirements as identified in the QAP should always supersede the guidance established in the data validation guidelines. So this is our QAP superhero, and this is a statement that is also in the introduction of the data validation guidelines. And so now that we looked at how projects should coordinate using the QAP, let's take a look back at a broader strategic framework for the new EPA 1633 module. Okay, so our primary objective with this specific framework was to increase EPA regulatory buy-in and support broader acceptance of Module 6, our PFAS module, And we want regulators to feel confident that the guideline is robust, standard, and highly reliable. And so to achieve this, we took a very deliberate approach when drafting the data validation guidelines. So the guidelines are written to fully incorporate all requirements of EPA 1633. And by doing this, we maintain alignment with the official expectations of the method and the scientific intent. And it should make it easier for the state and federal regulators to accept the validated data. And at the same time, we have to ensure that our Department of Defense requirements are fully accommodated. And so to balance those two, we've integrated the DoD QSM requirements throughout the document. However, to prevent any confusion for non-DoD projects, we've clearly labeled these additional requirements. So when a DoD specific rule appears, it's explicitly marked with the label requirements for DoD projects, optional for non-DoD projects. And so this dual pathway approach ensures that the document remains versatile, can be a powerful tool for DoD, and is accessible for other PFAS projects. And so with this dual labeled requirement integrated throughout the document, let's look at how our project teams might apply these in practice. Okay, the application of this framework is straightforward. So for all DoD projects, these integrated QSM requirements for the most part are going to be mandatory and so shall be implemented and validated. However, for non-DoD projects, these requirements are going to be strictly optional. And that distinction needs to be clearly understood and interpreted by the project teams, the regulators reviewing the plans, and the data validators executing the work. If you are working on non-DoD projects, you have the flexibility to bypass these extra DoD-specific steps if they do not serve the project goals. And again, ultimately, the key takeaway for this entire structure is that we've successfully created a dual framework for the data validation guidelines. And by separating and clearly labeling these requirements, we preserve the core integrity of EPA Method 1633 and incorporating and to support the rigorous needs of our DoD projects. So with the dual framework, we should hopefully reduce the overall burden on our data validators. And so now we're going to switch topics and move into the stages of data validation. Okay, so everything I'll be presenting is firmly grounded in our DoD data validation guidelines. And these guidelines outline the minimum requirements and expectations for all stages of data validation. And as you'll see, these stages are designed to purposely build upon one another to ensure data integrity, usability, and defensibility across the board. And so before we break down the individual stages, there are a few foundational elements required for all stages of data validation, which include the cover sheet, the table of contents, the laboratory case narrative, our sample results summary form, and two new ones, which is the laboratory defined data qualifiers and the records of um, customer approval and or communication. And so I want to highlight the sample results summary form. This is explicitly defined by QSM 6.0 Module 2 Clause 7.8. And many of you may remember that we have recently presented this at an EMDQ training, which is still available on Denex. And so in instances where I've referenced the previous presentation, I've put this little slide icon on there, and then I have it noted in a reference slide at the end of the presentation. And so what is new to the data validation and required across all data validation stages, specifically based on the updates of QSM 6.0, is first, we need the laboratory defined data qualifiers, which was required by Module 2, Clause 7831F, that states that the laboratory shall unambiguously define the data qualifiers used within the report. And secondly, we require records of customer approval and or communication, also in Module 2, Clause 7821C, and that dictates that customers or records of customer approval and technical justification for any waiver from QSM requirements shall be included in all affected reports. So bottom line, we really want to see that paper trail. And with those universal requirements established, we'll go ahead and move into stage 1. Okay, so the general requirements of the data validation guidelines will depend on the technology and method, so there could be additional elements which will be in the module specific data validation guidelines. For this presentation, I will be pointing out the PFAS specific elements. So the overall scheme for the stage 1 is the sample summary results form, chain of custody, sample receipt or checklist, holding time, or the field quality control data. Specific to PFAS, you'll notice that we have updated the layout for the hold time qualification scheme, and we are now presenting it in a clean, easy to follow table format, and I'll present that in the next slide. We also have some PFAS specific elements to discuss. So first is the transition ion summary. The key caveat here is that we would only evaluate this at stage 1 if it is provided by the laboratory in summary format. And if the laboratory does not provide it in such a way, the validation step would be deferred and occur at a higher stage. Similarly, we have a section for evaluating the total suspended solids, and this evaluation is highly dependent on your project-specific requirements, and it carries the same caveat. If the necessary data isn't present in a summary format, it may be evaluated at a higher stage of data validation. And so to give you an idea of how these updates look, we'll take a look at the draft holding time table so you can see the formatting used there. Okay, so when we're looking at this holding time qualification table, just want to keep in mind that this is still draft. The final qualifiers um, are still being discussed and may be adjusted by our subgroup based off the community feedback. And so, as many of you know, EPA Method 1633 has two very distinct holding time measurement requirements that we need to be able to track. Think collection to extraction and then extraction to analysis. And so to keep things familiar, this hold time qualification table is actually formatted similarly to EPA's hold time table found in section 856 of method 1633A. And you'll see that the field samples are organized by matrix types at the top row, and then the sample extract requirements defined directly below them. And this layout is designed to help you visualize the overall validation scheme based off the specific storage conditions. And remember, those storage conditions, along with the specific requirements for the analytes with shorter hold times, should have been explicitly defined upfront in our QAP worksheet 19 and 30. Additionally, we have explicitly noted in the document or directly below this table that validators are encouraged to use their professional judgment. And so when anomalies occur, the project team may need to look beyond the reported result and actively consider the project's conceptual site model to make the most defensible decision. Okay, next I wanted to briefly revisit a topic that I've previously talked about, the total suspended solids. And so as a reminder, EPA method 1633A recommends a limit of less than 50 milligrams of solid in the total volume. And ultimately, it's the project team responsibility to document the sample preparation decisions and communication pathways regarding total suspended solids. And we know that it should be documented in QAP worksheet 6, 12, and potentially 11, DQS step 6. And because of this, the subgroup actually decided to explicitly include a validation scheme within the data validation guidelines to address project-specific total suspended solid threshold. And so the new evaluation will work like this. First, the data validator must verify that the total suspended solid determinations were performed at the frequency specified by the QAP. And then if the threshold was exceeded and the project-specific procedures for sampling handling were either not provided or not followed, the data validator would take action. And in this scenario, they would probably qualify the associated results for detects as estimated J and non-detects as UJ. Okay, so now we're going to move into the stage 2A review, and not much has changed since my previous presentation, the overall scheme is to review the preparation-specific QC data and sample-specific parameter summaries. So our method blank, laboratory control samples, matrix spikes, and sample dilution or reanalysis. And then specific to PFAS, the QC data summaries would include the ion abundance ratio, our extracted and non-extracted internal standard recovery, retention time, our low-level LCS biosalts, and qualitative identification standard. So I'm not going to do too much review of stage 2A, but I did want to make note of an example data qualification table. So based on feedback from the community, the subgroup decided that all data validation guidelines would include these qualification tables like the example provided here. And so the qualification content will remain the same as it appears in the text, but just presented in this table format as an additional way to review the information to hopefully, make things a little bit easier for the community. Okay, so moving into stage 2B, the overall scheme is to review the instrument-specific QC data. And so we should be thinking about our sequence and prep logs, our instrument performance checks, our initial and continued calibration summaries, instrument blanks, as well as internal standard summary. And then specific to Module 6, we have some additional sequence and preparation log requirements. And then when we're thinking about the initial and continued calibration summaries, we should be thinking about the extracted internal standard responses, analyte and EIS concentrations, response ratios, response factors, and then the relative standard deviation or relative standard errors. So now I'm going to move into those highlighted green texts. Okay, so the first one that the data validator must verify that the laboratory followed the analytical sequence memo exactly as prescribed. The most stringent requirement here actually involves the sample volume. The rule is that the entire sample volume must be extracted, and if the laboratory did not extract the entire sample volume, you must immediately look for required paperwork. The data validator must find it. And so there must be records of the customer approval along with technical justification provided directly within the data package to support that deviation. And so if the entire volume was not extracted and those required records of approval and justification are not provided in the laboratory data package, this would be considered a nonconformity. And so in this scenario, the nonconformity must be noted in the data validation report, and the associated data would be qualified as exclusion of data is recommended. And so we require strict accountability and documentation when deviating from the prescribed extraction volumes. And so the X qualifier would actually draw attention to the project team during the data usability assessment for the project team to make a specific decision. Another updated requirement is a requirement updated from QSM 6.0. And so 6.0, whenever possible, requires that all calibration should be using reference material. And it's either using a certified reference material from an ISO 17034 accredited reference material provider or a standard reference material from a National Metrology Institute. And so with this update, the QSM 6.0 removed the requirement for the initial calibration verification when those SRMs or CRMs are employed. And we know previously the ICV was required to be a second independent source. And you see my little icon there, so this was previously presented at an EMDQ. And so what does that actually mean for the evolution of the data validation guidelines? When is ICV going to be a required data validation metric? And so it would be required when the calibration doesn't use an SRM or a CRM, when the laboratory chooses to perform and report the ICV, when it is a requirement of the reference method, and when the ICV is explicitly required by the project and noted on and we know in any of these instances that it should be reported on QAP worksheet 24 and 36 if it is going to be a data validation metric. And then so for our projects, we recommend that our project chemists coordinate early with their laboratories and data validators to get an understanding of if this will be a metric or not. And then the last highlighted item was the instrument blank. And so if an instrument blank is run prior to sample analysis and is outside of the acceptance criteria, the standard protocol is that all affected detects must be J qualified as estimated. However, we still want to maintain the data validator flexibility here, and so the data validator has the authority to review the run log and based off their professional judgment of the sequence, determine if more appropriate qualification scheme is warranted. And so in the update, we actually added qualification to this draft to clarify what happens when things don't go perfectly in the laboratory. Okay, so now we're going to move into stage 3, and the overall scheme here is the instrument quantitation forms, looking at our raw data for our sample results and our method and instrument QC, as well as standard traceability. And then specific for module 6, for the method and instrument QCs, we know that's our EIS and NIS recoveries, retention time, our laboratory control samples, matrix spikes, instrument sensitivity checks, or calibration verification, and our response factors or response ratios. And now we're going to move into the new data validation scheme. And as a quick reminder before we get into it, we're still actively working through the comments submitted, but we wanted to take the time today to present the EDQW's current views on the new data validation scheme. And so this scheme was actually developed in coordination with the EDQW's emerging contaminant group. And so just please understand that nothing is set in stone just yet. And so when we were developing this new scheme, the overall goal was to strike the right balance. We want to reduce the overall burden on our data validators, but simultaneously ensuring that the data continues to be appropriately and accurately validated. And so with those goals in mind, we can move into the flow chart. Um, okay, so we're looking at this proposed data validation flow chart for stage 3 data validation. And this gives us a high level view of the new scheme from start to finish. And it will be found in the appendix of the data validation guidelines. And I just wanted to start by showing you the complete process so you'll be able to understand how these pieces will fit together. And so overall, we see it's being proposed as a core 4-step process and would only require those 5th and 6th steps if the method blank or the instrument blank fails their acceptance criteria. And so we're going to step through each individual step now so you can see the details as well as the rationale. Okay, so now that we've seen the overall 4-step framework, we'll zoom in on step 1, the initial calibration reconstruction, which is the foundational step for the entire data set. Okay, so the process begins with the initial calibration, and we're actually proposing 2 options that provide flexibility for your project. So this allows you to choose an either broad, less frequent check or a more targeted, more frequent one, depending on your project specific needs. And I want to draw your attention specifically to option 2. This option is entirely new to the data validation guidelines. And so in this instance, one iCal will be reconstructed per standard delivery group, per laboratory, per project, and it will be recalculated, it will be reconstructed for 100% of the target analytes. Because it introduces a new approach, it requires active coordination between the project chemist and the data validators to determine what is most appropriate for their specific project. And we know whatever you decide, this must be formally documented in our UFP QAP worksheet, typically on worksheet number 36. And so finally, I want to emphasize an important terminology. The new data validation guideline uses the term reconstruction, and it's critical that these terms are not used interchangeably with recalculation and requantitation. So when we're saying reconstruction, we mean the independent recreation of the calibration curve directly from the instrument output to verify the laboratory provided curve used for quantitation. And we choose these terms very carefully throughout the document to ensure that the data validator is doing targeted validation rather than unnecessary or duplicative work. Okay, so once we've verified the foundation of our iCal reconstruction in step 1, where do we go from here? And we're going to move to step 2, the laboratory control sample. And this is a critical point for the entire batch. Okay, so as you can see from this step, we're proposing a 100% requantitation and recalculation for the target analytes EIS and NIS. And so I want to acknowledge that we did receive some comments that this might seem excessive. And it's a fair point, but I wanted to take a moment to address the thinking behind this. The intention here is to front load the data validation effort by ensuring only one laboratory control sample is validated with 100% accuracy at an early stage. We establish a high degree of confidence in the analytical batch as a whole. So this rigorous upfront work is um, what allows us to be more targeted and less burdensome in subsequent steps. And so think of it as an investment effort where it has the most impact and then pays off by reducing your workload later. And so performing this 100% check ensures that ensures a detected result for each target compound and verifies the quantitation and calculations were performed correctly. Additionally, by using a laboratory control sample, we are able to capture that the EIS and NIS were also properly quantitated and calculated properly. Um, Additionally, we're only requiring one laboratory control sample or low-level laboratory control sample to be selected, whereas before it was 10% of the LCS, low-level LCS and LCSD. Just like we had defined reconstruction in our last step, we want to clearly define the terms we're using here as they dictate the specific actions the data validator would take. So first, requantitation means using the results of the instrument output and the laboratory provided calibration curve to verify the quantitation of the reported concentration. And then recalculation involves taking those reported concentrations to verify any post-quantitation QC results, which we know may include dilution factors, unit conversion, percent moisture, and any QC metrics such as percent recovery. Okay, so now that we've invested that 100% effort in stage 2 and we have confidence in our analytical batch, we can begin to reap the rewards of that upfront workload. So we'll transition to step 3 and we'll look at the CCV or the instrument sensitivity check and how the workload actually decreases. So for step 3, we're proposing a frequency of just one CCV or one instrument sensitivity check because we've already performed a 100% check on the LCS in step 2. And so we can reduce the validation requirements for this CCV or instrument sensitivity check to just 10% of recalculation and requantitation for the analytes and EIS. Okay, so now that we've completed the validation check on the calibration and our quality control samples, because we've had a solid foundation in steps 1 through 3, we can turn our attention to the data we care most about, our field sample detects. So let's see how that will look. Okay, so in step 4, for the field samples, we return to 100% recalculation, but it's important to note that this applies only to detected analytes. We're not asking you to recheck every possible analyte, only the ones that were actually detected in the sample. And this ensures that positive results are accurate without creating unnecessary work. Additionally, we are only requiring one field sample to be selected, whereas before it was 10% of the sample data chosen. Okay, and so Once we've completed the targeted review of the field sample in step 4, we reach the final part of our proposed scheme, steps 5 and 6, which cover our method and instrument blanks. And the most important thing to note here is it's entirely conditional. So let's take a look at how these act as a safety net rather than a routine task, hopefully further reducing the overall burden. So 5 and 6 are only triggered if a blank fails its acceptance criteria. This is another key part of our goal to reduce burden. If a system is clean and running as expected, no extra work is needed, and reinforces the idea that if the process is in control, the validation efforts should be minimized. Okay, so now I just wanted to kind of bring this flowchart back up on the screen in full and summarize what we've talked through. So this proposed stage 3 validation scheme is designed to be smart and balanced. And by performing that comprehensive 100% check upfront on a single laboratory control sample, we establish confidence early on. And then we earn the ability to significantly reduce the workload in later stages. And hopefully the process focuses your time and effort where it matters most, specifically on detected analytes in your field sample and not fixing issues and fixing issues only when they arise in the blank rather than performing a repetitive check when the system is already performing well. And another procedural note, as you look at this diagram, these steps do not have to be performed in a specific order. We just kind of wrote them in sequential steps to facilitate a logical flow of the flowchart illustration. However, if you review the actual module, you'll see we don't dictate exactly how a data validator conducts their work. You still have full control over your personal workflow and can execute these tasks in the order that makes the most sense for your specific process. And then I also want you to notice an additional omission. We did not include the matrix spike or matrix duplicate in this standard workflow. We left them out because these checks are not strictly required by the EPA method 1633. And so these would only be required for validation if they are explicitly required by our project-specific QAP. And so again, ultimately the goal here was to create a workflow that's robust, ensures data quality, but also realistic and sustainable for the data validators. And we believe this targeted approach achieves that vital balance. And I wanted to thank you again for those comments to help refine this process, and we're still working on those. So I did just want to take about a minute for you to post in the chat specifically how you're kind of feeling about this stage 3 data validation scheme. And so I have you maybe feel optimistic, you see less routine work, more logical workflow. Maybe you're cautiously unsure, you like it in theory, but you need to test it out. Maybe you're excited, but you want to reserve the right to grump about it later. Fair enough. Or maybe you feel a different way or overwhelmed, you don't like change, and you need a minute to process. So if you could just let us know so then our group can kind of take that into considerations when we review the comments as well, that would be nice. Um, okay, so I'm gonna keep moving on then. Next is stage 4, the qualitative review. The overall scheme for the data validation guidelines would be the instrument output raw data again, reviewing the DL, LOD, and LOQ, our target analyte identification, and manual integration. And specific to module 6, we need to be thinking about the qualitative peak identification section of the EPA method 1633. Okay, so for the interest of time, I'm not going to dive into the method requirements, but a good resource again is my previous EMDQ presentation of June of last year. And so I did just want to remind everyone of the method requirements. And so Section 15, Clause 15.1 states that samples shall meet the acceptance criteria of Clause 15.1.1 through 15.1.4. And then if the acceptance criteria is not met for a field sample, we would expect qualification. But if the acceptance criteria is not met for a QC or standard, then we would expect the laboratory to have corrected those issues. So now let's look at those requirements in the data validation guidelines. Okay, so we're gonna shift slightly to look at how to address some of the historical interpretations regarding the qualitative peak identification, specifically concerns around the ion abundance ratio, the retention times, and the signal to noise ratio. And so in previous versions of the data validation guideline, the language surrounding the qualitative peak identification was somewhat vague. It stated that if an evaluation was considered invalid, the data validator should confer with the project POC to consider changing a detect to a non-detect. And in practice, the EDQW observed that those strict method requirements of 15.1.4 were not being explicitly followed. And we want to be clear that we're not saying this was done maliciously, but a potential oversight. And so to fix this, the new data validation guidelines module includes much more detailed information to ensure that the data is qualified based off the precise method requirements. And the new rule is explicit. If any of the qualitative peak identification acceptance criteria are not met, qualitative identification of the target analyte is formally considered unconfirmed. And so first, if the identity is unconfirmed in a standard or QC sample, it's not ambiguous. All affected data should be qualified as X, and exclusion of data is recommended because this is based off of the method requirements. And then second, if the identity is unconfirmed in the field sample, the data validator may qualify detects as estimated J, and non-detects would not require qualification. And any of these non-conformities should be noted in the data validation report. And the data validator should actively inform the QAP POC, and the team should take additional actions to correct and revise the report. And finally, we wanted to empower our data validators. And so if in their professional judgment there is instance where the field sample result is compromised, that it should be qualified as X with exclusion of data recommended, that should be noted, and the project team should be made aware as soon as practicable. And then, as promised, I do have these resources slides of everything that I've cited in my presentation. And then I also just put in the links for the specific items that I presented. And then to close it up, I'll just say thank you from the Data Review and Management subgroup. And yes, I think I went over time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nancy. You're actually good. We have 2 minutes left for our next round. As Nancy mentioned, we are going to collect the questions, and her and Melinda's answered a few already I've seen, but we will gather the questions and have those answers for you.
Okay, thanks.
But yeah, thank you again, Nancy. Really appreciate that. So let's